Hey there, the video does not aim to discredit Red Bull or Max Verstappen's achievement in the ground effect era. It does, however, question whether these regulations have failed to achieve their objectives. With that being said, let's get to the video.
In the last 2 seasons, Mercedes has 1 win, Ferrari has 5 wins, and Red Bull has 38 wins. In terms of drivers, George Russell has 1 win, Carlos Sainz has 2, Charles Leclerc has 3, while Sergio Perez has 4. Max Verstappen, on the other hand, has 34 wins. That's the stats from the last 2 seasons. And after the pre-season test, there's one thing that seems evidently clear. Once again, Red Bull has been able to maintain the kind of advantage it had over the field last season as well. So yes, there is a very high possibility that in 2024, we are looking at a repeat of a dominant season from Red Bull and Max Verstappen. And all of this raises one major question. Have these new ground effect rules been a complete failure? Let's try to answer this question. Now, before I do that, let me make one thing clear. I'm not in any which way trying to discredit the kind of work that Red Bull has done. That's not my point. I'm specifically focusing on the regulations, because when the regulations are made, there is a certain set of objectives that they have to fulfill. That is my entire focus. In no way am I trying to belittle what Max Verstappen has achieved, and in no way am I trying to belittle what Red Bull has done with these regulations. With that being clear, let's try to dissect what I mean when I question whether these regulations have been a complete failure. Now, to answer this question, what we'll try to do is we'll try to take a look at the objectives that these regulations had. Then we'll take a look at whether these objectives have been fulfilled or not. And if they've not been fulfilled, I think that will help us answer the question. Now, first of all, let's take a look at objectives. Now, the first one was that these regulations will help reduce the field spread. Now, when I talk about the field spread, I mean the gap between the first and the last team. Ultimately, the aim was to reduce this gap, and to do that, we had a more prescriptive regulations in place. Now, the prescriptive means that there's not too much freedom for the designers to, explore different areas. Now, when there are not too many areas that can be exploited, what ends up happening is the cars, they tend to be a bit more similar, and hence the gaps between the teams, it tends to be smaller. And it also helps bring the drivers into play as well. Next up, the second part was the cars will be easier to follow. Now, when we talk about the cars being easier to follow, until 2021, the cars were losing almost 50% of their downforce when they were following in other cars. Well, why that happened? It was happening primarily because the downforce being generated on the previous generation of cars, it was done through the front wing, the upper side of the body. Now, what they did was it led to production of the turbulent air. Now, that turbulent air caused disturbance to the car that was following the car in the lead. And because of that, there was a net loss in downforce. By 2021, that was expected to be around 50% of the overall downforce. Now, with the new regulations in ground effect, the aim was to reduce this, and it was expected to be much smaller, and hence helping the raceability of these cars. Now, the third key aspect was the sliding scale development time to prevent single team dominance. Now, what that basically meant was the teams at the top, they have the least development time in terms of the time they can spend in the wind tunnel. Then at the bottom, the team that is at the lowest point, that is in 10th, it will have the maximum possible time to develop their cars. And this sliding scale, the aim to have such a sliding scale was so that no single team that is at the top will continue to hold the advantage, because the teams lower down the order will have more time to develop their cars and hence close the gap to the front. Okay, now with that being clear, let's try to assess whether all these aspects and all these objectives have actually been fulfilled. Now, the first objective was reduce the field spread. And I think it's safe to say that we can agree with that. The field overall from front to the bottom, it has reduced. And one of the key examples of something like this was last season as well, where there were quite a few races where there were 7 different teams that were in top 10. Also, last season we had 6 different teams on the podium. And that is in an era where reliability is not a major issue, and hence it was achieved on the basis of performance. So yes, in terms of objectives, this one is actually fulfilled. Now, the next one is the cars will be easier to follow. Now, this one is slightly concerning because, as I earlier said, that in 2021, it was at 50%, the average downforce loss when a car was following another car. However, in 2022, with the new regulations, this was dropped down drastically to only 20%. Yes, this was the massive difference that we actually achieved by 2022. However, by 2023, with more and more development on these cars, on the front wings as well as upper body, what that has done is that it has led to a rise in the turbulent air. Now, last year, Nicholas Tombazis, who was the FIA technical director, he revealed that the aerodynamic loss had risen to 35% in 2023. Now, in 2024, as we can already see, there has been major strides made when it comes to development on the front wings. And when that happens, we are looking at a scenario where this number of the aerodynamic loss, it is going to increase even more. It will be more than 35%. Will it be 40? Will it be 45? Who knows? And that is basically an indication that the objective that was set out earlier at the start of the regulations, it's not being achieved. And the result? Well, the result will be the fact that we'll be back to the level of raceability where we were in 2021 or before that. The main objective that the cars will be more racier, or how we saw in 2022 where you had multiple overtakes. We're not going to see that anymore, and we'll be back to how the racing was in 2021, which was probably not a desirable outcome for these regulations. Now for the third point, the sliding scale development time, which would aid the team at the bottom to close the gap to the front. Now let's be fair, I think we've seen the last 2 seasons, and the kind of gaps that have existed, they've not really closed with this kind of sliding scale method. There has hardly been any noticeable change, in fact, and we really can't sit down and say that this particular move has actually helped in any which way. The team that was at the bottom in 2022 or 2023, they will continue to be at the bottom. We've not seen any noticeable growth from any of those teams. In fact, one of the major indictments of this regulation has been what happened with Red Bull. Red Bull already had the least development time in 2023. Even that was reduced by 10% because of the penalty for the cost cap infringement. Despite that, Red Bull continued to hold the advantage, and the field could not really close the gap significantly. When something like this happens, it shows that the intended outcome has not been achieved. And that's where the main problem comes in. When there are steps that are put in place to prevent dominance and they don't really serve the purpose, then what that shows is maybe the steps and the regulations, they didn't really do the job. We're basically back to the kind of dominance that was there with Mercedes during the turbo hybrid era. And even the raceability will be gone by this season. So when you take all these things into consideration, you have to question why even the regulations were changed. Now again, my main indictment is not on Red Bull or Max Verstappen, let me make it clear. It is on how the regulations have not had the intended effect. We are looking at a third season of dominance, which is something that these regulations were not intended for. And maybe that is a question we need an answer for. Now, of course, there are steps that can be taken in the future. There are things that could be done. For instance, maybe have a better method instead of the sliding scale development time that could actually aid a prevention of dominance. That has not been done yet. Or there could even be far more stringent restrictions on developments on the front wing. Maybe we can do that. Maybe that will prevent the increase in downforce loss that these cars are suffering right now. So yes, there are steps that the FIA can take, but for now, what these regulations were intended to do, they've not really done that. We've not had a single title battle in, I think it would be 3 years now. We've had dominance, and we've had similar dominance as compared to what we did with the Mercedes era just before this one. So overall, are these regulations a step up? No, they aren't. Are these regulations serving the purpose that they were supposed to? No, they haven't. So yes, that's where I stand. Do let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching and see you next time.